Hello, viewers. I'm your host, Mian Samair, and I welcome you all on behalf of Bonds Management Group. And today we have a very senior management consultant, a teacher with over 30 years of experience in child welfare. And she is from Northern Ontario, and she is a band member of Timiskaming First Nation. Please join me in welcoming Marion Roberts from Sudbury, Ontario. Hi, Marion. How are you doing today?
Oh, good morning, Mian. I'm doing well, thank you. I would like to say bonjour to everybody. And before beginning, I would like to acknowledge that, yes, I live and work in Sudbury, which is located on the Huron Treaty Territory, which is home of the Anishinaabe and Adamashing people.
Thank you. Thank you, Marion, for joining us, and it's a pleasure to have you. I would like to tell viewers that today we are going to talk about truth and reconciliation. So today's topic is truth and reconciliation. And before we start, I would like to ask you, please tell our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Well, I have a master's degree in social work, and for about 30 years, I worked in provincial child welfare, both in Sudbury and Ottawa. And since joining Barnes Management Group in 2006, my consulting practice has been with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people across Ontario, predominantly, mostly in Treaty 3, Treaty 9, and the Anishinaabe Nation. And some of the projects that I have been working with are community capacity development with First Nation communities, as well as First Nation organizations. And most recently working with 5 First Nations on Bill C-92, which is helping to facilitate the communities in the development of their own child and family services laws. I've also been involved in projects connected with strategic planning and reconciliation on several national projects.
Wow, amazing. There is a lot to cover. I'm not sure if we can able to cover all those, but without any further ado, now let's just come to our topic, which is truth and reconciliation. So would you mind please telling us what is truth and reconciliation, and why is it important?
Okay, well, firstly, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed in 2008 in this country to document the experiences of residential school survivors. And secondly, it was established to lay a foundation for new relationships to develop between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country based on truth, understanding, and mutual respect. So the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was part of a settlement agreement between the First Nations and the federal government in a class action lawsuit about the abuses suffered and the intergenerational trauma that resulted from their residential school experiences. The commission traveled the country for 6 years, hearing testimony from over 6,500 people, which included both residential school survivors as well as former teachers, clergy, the review of federal government and church records. And finally, in 2015, the commission released their report, and that report was called Honoring the Truth, Reconciling the Future, and Reconciliation Commission. And the Reconciliation Commission released some 94 calls to action along with that report. The reason this report is so important and significant is because it really revealed to all Canadians the truth about the history and the ongoing legacy of church-run residential schools, and it recorded individual as well as collective harms that were perpetrated against First Nation peoples. It also honors the resilience and the courage of the former students, of their families and their communities. And it also lays out a guide and a process for how truth and healing, leading towards reconciliation, both within families, between First Nation peoples, the churches, the government, and Canadians generally. And so this process is really work to renew relationships on a basis of inclusion, mutual understanding, and respect.
Right. So, Marion, being an expert of how do you see how can reconciliation be meaningful?
Well, the thing about reconciliation is it is all about truth. It's about apology. It's about respect, and it's about engagement. And for it to be meaningful, it needs to be authentic. And thus, people who want to engage in a reconciliation process need to be committed to reconciliation, and they need to understand that it's a journey, it's a process. Like, for example, many people today, as I did when I started this session, was I do a land acknowledgement. Reconciliation goes way beyond doing land acknowledgement. It's really about a journey of understanding the process and embracing a series of actions and activities.
Right. So, as you mentioned, reconciliation is a journey and engagement. So, what do you think? What are the activities we can engage in to advance the reconciliation?
There really are many things people can do to advance reconciliation. But the first and foremost is to learn the history. Learn the history of Indigenous peoples. Learn about colonization. Learn about the residential school system and the intergenerational trauma. Because knowledge is the first step towards reconciliation. Take the time to read the Truth and Reconciliation Report and the calls to action. Learn the history of where you live. How many First Nations are in around the area that you live? Who lived first on the land in the city that you now call home? Take time to visit a First Nation community in your area. Attend cultural events, go to powwows, meet and get to know your Indigenous neighbors. Find ways to acknowledge national Indigenous events in Canada and participate in local activities that are occurring. For example, June is National Indigenous History Month. That's a good time to, take a pause and seek out information about Indigenous history. During the month of June, if you Google National Indigenous History Month, you will come up with a plethora of sites to visit regarding the history of Indigenous people. June 21st is actually National Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada, and almost every community in this country will have activities going on either at the First Nation communities itself or at friendship centers in the city. Local libraries, for example, may be offering activities. So it's a day that you can find activities that you can participate in Canada.
Right. Very interesting.
I just wanted to mention one other important date, and that's September 30th is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This is a new federal holiday, and this holiday commemorates and honors the lost children and survivors of residential schools, their families and communities. And it's a day where both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people wear orange t-shirts to honor the lost children. And a simple thing that people can do is to don or wear an orange t-shirt on September 30th. This signifies your support and that you are honoring the lost children. First, as I said, First Nations libraries, municipalities, and friendship centers across the country acknowledge these important dates, and there are often cultural events that you can participate in.
Right.
Other things, I
Yeah.
was just going to say, other
Yeah.
things you can do to advance reconciliation is, read Indigenous authors. Go online, read Indigenous news sites. For example, you can Google Windspeaker, you can Google CBC Indigenous News or APTN News and Television. Other things you can do is to support Indigenous visual and performing artists by watching Indigenous films, going to an Indigenous art gallery, going to powwows. So it's not just learning the history, but experiencing the culture through artistic expression of that culture and seeing traditional dance, traditional music, jewelry making, beading, drumming, and basket weaving, just to name a few.
Wow, there are so many events and activities, and I am learning a lot from this conversation, actually, and this is really amazing. So, Marian, another question which comes to my mind: how can we take this reconciliation from the personal level into professional lives?
Okay. Well, I mentioned earlier the Truth and Reconciliation Report and the calls to action. And the calls to action are really specific recommendations that are aimed at all Canadians. They're directed not only to government, but to disciplines such as child welfare, education, health, justice, the media, churches, businesses, and industry at large. And if you look at those calls to action, you will see where it is that you work may be represented in one of those calls to action. So for example, education, there are calls to action around education. So one thing educators can do in their professional lives is to make sure they're incorporating Indigenous history and culture into their curriculum at school. Researchers, for example, can examine Indigenous research methodologies and teach about Indigenous pedagogy and epistemology. Business and industry leaders can implement the call to action 92, which asks the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework and apply its principles, norms, and standards to their corporate policies and to their core operations. Organizations and businesses can commit to meaningful consultation and build respectful relationships. And when there are economic development projects going on in or near First Nation communities in or around their lands, ensure that the First Nation communities that you have prior and informed consent before proceeding with any economic development. Ensure that Indigenous communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from any economic development project. And I think it's important for organizations across the country to provide education for their management and staff on the history of Indigenous people, including the history and legacy of the residential schools. Yeah, so I think it's important to, talk to your colleagues where you work, talk to your employer, and find out where your organization fits into the calls to action and find out what steps you can take as a group.
Very informative, Marian, very informative. So as we're talking about employer and call to action, now let's talk about BMG. Can you share with us what BMG has been doing so far in this area of reconciliation?
Well, one thing that we have done is that we've forged many trusting relationships with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities, predominantly in Ontario. Over the years, we make efforts to promote Indigenous history, knowledge, and worldviews. We take opportunities on days such as National Indigenous History Month, National Indigenous Day, National Day of Reconciliation, and we honor Indigenous people on our website, and we bring attention on our site to the social justice issues that are faced by Indigenous peoples today. We ensure that our associates are aware of the history and of the rights of Indigenous people and of our commitment as an organization to the social justice issues that are facing Indigenous peoples. As a consulting firm, we have taken on several major projects that support, facilitate, and advance Indigenous self-governance in the fields of both healthcare and child welfare. In the projects that we work on in equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, we always seek to include reconciliation as a part of any organization's EDI plan, and we include and to include Indigenous people in their recruitment and hiring of diverse talent. And we've worked with several national organizations in the development of strategic plans that include reconciliation as a key strategic priority. We have a deep commitment at Barnes Management Group to the advancement of reconciliation.
Thank you, Marion. And due to time limitations, we need to finish this episode here. We have many more questions, but I think we need to have a part 2 for this. And I would like to thank you. It was a pleasure to have you. New information, at least I learned a lot from this conversation, and it was very interesting and very informative conversation. And thank you so much.
Miigwech.
So I would like to request now my viewers, please like, subscribe, and share BMG, and stay tuned for more updates and for more informative videos, and bye for now.